like, I will forget. Automatic. See, when we let the bots do the thing. Okay.
Before we get started, Andrea, just a quick, Sydney, can you pronounce your last name for me again? I just want to make sure I get it right. I feel like I always get it wrong.
You're fine. It's hula Bach. So hula like the dance, Bach like the composer.
Hula Bach. I got it.
Nice one in Norwegian.
Gotcha. And David, yours is Yaros?
Yep, correct.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys. Christy, I think I got yours.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody. For folks just trickling in, we are recording, just about to get started. And welcome. Okay, great. All right, well, I'm happy to kick us off. Tina, is everyone ready?
I think we are ready to go.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those on the East Coast, and welcome to our second learning session of 2024. Of course, this is hosted by the New Mexico Impact Investing Collaborative. I am the fellow for the collaborative. I've been with the organization now for over a year in my role in volunteer work in the state legislature. And of course, as an attorney, this has been an incredible just compilation of so many great things that are happening around New Mexico that NMIIC is driving as a member-driven collaborative designed to catalyze and scale impact investing throughout the state of New Mexico. Our mission as NMIIC is to basically create healthy, equitable, sustainable, and economically vibrant communities within the state of New Mexico. And we do this by not only facilitating and increasing the supply of effective deployment capital with impact investing throughout the state. We also host these learning sessions to not only learn from our community, but give us a chance to interact with what's happening on the ground in your communities. So really grateful to have you all here today. And of course, facilitating all of this is Avivar Capital, the New Mexico Impact Investing Collaborative's Impact Investment Advisor, who's been working with NMIIC for over a decade now. And here with hosting and helping us facilitate today is partner of Avivar Capital, Tina Castro. And I will hand it over to Tina here.
Great. Thanks so much, Andrea, and welcome everybody. It's great to be with you this morning. As Andrea said, I am one of the co-founders and managing partners of Avivar Capital. We've had the pleasure and the privilege of getting to work with NMIIC for the better part of the last decade, really, since they got started. So it's been great to see how the work has evolved over the years. And this morning, we are looking forward to the conversation. We're going to be talking about how NMIIC and other impact investors can support access to working capital for nonprofits in this state. So I think as we all know, nonprofit organizations are really vital partners to government in delivering critically important safety net services to vulnerable populations, and also in implementing innovative new policies like the Inflation Reduction Act. However, many nonprofits face financial challenges, they face administrative challenges in delivering those services and in accessing those resources to help implement policies and in working with government. So, as Andrea said, as a collaborative of impact investors and grant makers, NMIIC believes that the deployment of integrated capital, so deploying both grant dollars and also investment capital in a coordinated fashion, can help nonprofits overcome these challenges and these barriers and can support them in doing the important work that they do in New Mexico and help to make New Mexico a healthier, more equitable, and sustainable state. So in today's session, we're going to be speaking with three experts. We're very fortunate to have with us today. They come at this issue from a variety of different perspectives and different kinds of work, but I think on the whole are going to give us a really great perspective on what we can do to be supportive of the nonprofit sector. So I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves and talk about their backgrounds, but just and to give you a sense of who's with us, we have Christy Dorr, who's the Executive Director of Groundworks New Mexico. We have David Yaros, who's Principal and Co-Lead of Deloitte Tax's U.S. Sustainability Practice. And we have Sydney Hulabach, who is the Impact Investment Manager for the Go ATL Fund at the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta. So we're really lucky to have them with us. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we pass it off, though, just a few kind of housekeeping items. So we're hoping to make the discussion today in the session as interactive as we can. So we may be pulling participants into the conversation as we go. Anybody who's joined me for one of these sessions knows that I love cold calling, so don't be surprised if I call on you. And then also just quick, we're going to do a quick poll to get a better sense of who's with us today. So we know who we're speaking with and who's on the line. So I'm going to turn it over to Andrea or Carla, who's also on the line with us, to go ahead and launch that poll. There'll be a few questions, and then once we wrap that up, we will dive in from there.
All right, so the poll is live if you're in front of your Zoom and you have a chance to pop in some answers for us. We'd love to get to know our audience. And our panelists can see, I believe, the live results. Is that right? Are you guys seeing it in real time as well, or just... Oh, this is very fun. Leave it up for another few seconds, almost 100% participation. So thank you all for being so active with us. And we'll go ahead and end the poll right there. And I'm going to share results with everybody. So great to be on theme today for what we're going to be talking about in working capital for nonprofits. So hopefully everyone can see that. I'll just share verbally. Our nonprofit cohort today is about 67% of our audience. We have foundations, government, and some private sector here as well, but definitely mostly nonprofits. Nonprofit working capital is absolutely a challenge at 92% of the folks who participated. And certainly, if having easier access to working capital was available, it would be more effective and have a greater impact, 100%. So we're grateful to have that sort of insight as we get going. Handing over back to you, Tina.
Great. Thanks, Andrea. Maybe a few more points, which I forgot to mention. So we are recording today, and participants will get a copy of the recording after the session. If you have questions, please do feel free to drop them in the chat. We're going to be monitoring the chat throughout, and happy to take questions throughout or leave them to the end if if there's a lot of them and we can't get to all of them. And then I would also encourage you to drop your name and the organization that you're with in the chat as well, so we can see who's with us today. So with that, let's dive in. I'm going to turn it over first to Christy. Christy, if you could please kick us off by telling us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about Groundworks.
Yeah, thanks for having me. My name's Christy Dorr. I'm the Executive Director at Groundworks New Mexico, and we are a membership organization that's serving the state of New Mexico. The social sector, we provide resources, education, training, and really work to unite the social sector here in New Mexico.
Fantastic. Thanks, Christy. And David, how about you?
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dave Yaros. I'm a tax principal at Deloitte. I lead our sustainability tax practice here across the country. I've spent the last 25 years helping our clients secure credits and incentives across a variety of industries. Historically, it was pretty much always in the commercial or for-profit sector, but all of that changed in August of 22 with the enactment of the Inflation Reduction Act, which really provides an unprecedented opportunity for non-for-profits to get cash refunds for various clean energy investments. And that could include obviously non-for-profits that are here, as well as state and local governments, foundations, higher education. Basically, non-tax-paying entities are now going to be able to file for cash refunds to help with their clean energy investment. So a lot has changed in the last 2 years, and I'm excited to share more as part of this call and figure out how we can possibly help the folks secure some of these cash refunds as part of the overall finance stack. Deloitte is the largest professional services firm in the world. We obviously offer audit and accounting and tax and consulting services. We also pride ourselves around purpose. And so we have a chief purpose office that invests a lot of time in pro bono work within various communities around the country. So super excited to be here today with everybody.
Fantastic, David. Thanks. And Sydney, how about you?
Yeah, thanks, Tina. Nice to be with everyone. My name is Sydney Hulabach, and I am part of the impact investing team here at the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta. So not in New Mexico, but doing very similar work or looking towards similar solutions with some of our products here. So we manage 3 different funds in-house and 1 partner fund here at the foundation that's focused on impact investing. And then we have a complementary guarantee pool, which I'll talk a bit about later. But our work has really scaled over the past 2 or so years, from a $15 million fund partnering with our CDFIs here locally to almost $200 million in assets under management for impact investing. So happy to share some of the operational challenges and opportunities in those spaces with you all, and then talk a bit about how we've supported nonprofits in that space. I'll also say I used to manage something called the Georgia Social Impact Collaborative, which is similar to what NMIIC does, but in the state of Georgia. So really excited to be part of this conversation. Thanks for having me.
Phenomenal. Thanks, Sydney. So, Christy, let's circle back to you and maybe let's probe a little bit deeper. Can you expand on the work that Groundworks does with nonprofits, particularly those that might be working with state and local government? So maybe tell us a little bit about what challenges those organizations face financially and administratively, maybe some of the common needs that you see among them, and the things Groundworks is doing to try and help.
Yeah, absolutely. So Groundworks provides training and technical assistance to nonprofits, local governments, tribal entities, and pueblos throughout our state. And we do this through our Center for Nonprofit Excellence, which is housed within our Social Sector Institute. We focus on some critical areas that are really high needs for nonprofit organizations, but of course for governments as well. And those include financial management, strategic planning, communications, board development, operational capacity is of course a huge one, mission orientation, and then just staff management. So a lot of professional development, workforce development. And then I thought to frame what we're talking about today and looking at like, what are these organizational challenges, particularly here in New Mexico, like these financial and administrative challenges. It might be useful to look at it from the lens of the federal funding opportunities that we're talking about. So using the example of the Federal Justice 40 initiative. So for those that aren't familiar, this is an executive order. It mandates that 40% of certain funds, so about like 470 programs are covered by this, that those funds are steered towards disadvantaged communities in areas such as climate change, housing, workforce development. New Mexico has a higher percentage of Justice 40 coverage than almost any other state. Like our needs here for our organizations are critical. So to me, this is telling us our organizations and our local governments are facing steep challenges, both financially and administratively. Half of our nonprofits here in New Mexico are outside of the Bernalillo, Santa Fe counties. So they're dealing with broadband challenges in addition to workforce challenges. One of those areas for the federal grant, I mean, one federal grant can take 75 to 200 hours to prepare an application and get it submitted. So not many organizations that have that kind of extra time to put towards an application, even when the return might be really high. So one of the other challenges that organizations typically face here are the staff expertise. These are really complex applications, and federal funds have strict requirements on who's eligible to apply for those funds, what that format needs to be, the content, supporting materials. And so oftentimes just getting the experts in your own organization can be very challenging to do that. So you may need to have the funds to, thousands of dollars to be able to hire outside experts to support an application process to pursue these federal dollars and grant opportunities. And then once you get those funds, say you're one of the lucky individual organizations or collectives that can get access to a federal fund, you've got strict compliance, you've got reporting, there's accounting, and the consequences are pretty steep. So I think those are some of the biggest things that we face here in New Mexico, but this is also a challenge that my fellow panelists will be able to talk to. This is something we're all dealing with, but the need here is really high in New Mexico for just the expertise and overcoming some of these barriers like broadband access.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Christy. And you mentioned, the list that you went through, I think sort of lands kind of on that administrative side.
Yeah.
I think that there are also financial challenges that we spoke a little bit about. Maybe you could just put a finer point on that also.
Yeah, so some of those, it's expensive. When you're applying for federal dollars, like you may, oftentimes with these funds, you have to put in a match, or there needs to be some sort of, there's a repayment kind of. I like the solar panel example for, if you put solar panels on your house, like you get a tax credit, but you have to pay for that funding up front. And so a lot of these funding opportunities for organizations are really similar. So that means organizations have to have, potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars in capital that's available to be able to apply for these funding opportunities. And so that's another challenge, being able to get consultants, have that back-end support, which means financial resources, or just having those dollars available that are necessary to get these funds.
Yeah. And you had mentioned, and maybe we'll come back to this a little bit later in the conversation, but just to plant the reminder in your mind, we had talked a little bit about some of the ideas around how to tackle that, maybe, providing support for that on a shared basis. So let's come back to that in a little bit. But maybe, David, coming over to you, you had mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the single largest investment in climate and energy resilience in American history. Can you provide a brief overview of the act, particularly the direct pay provisions that you mentioned, and the challenges that you've seen nonprofits facing in accessing those resources?
Yeah, absolutely. So Inflation Reduction Act, as you mentioned, Tina, it is the largest investment in clean energy in the history of the United States. And it's done through the tax code. So these are tax credits to help support investments in clean energy. And historically, for my entire career and forever, tax credits were really, that allowed corporations and taxpayers to get a tax credit and offset their tax liability. And what really changed in the Inflation Reduction Act, as I mentioned in the opening, was basically allowing non-for-profits, non-tax-paying entities who are making these qualified investments to file a tax form with the IRS and to receive a cash refund to offset that investment. When the act was first enacted in August of 22, the price at that time was estimated to be around $270 billion associated with these tax credits. Today, as we sit here in September of 24, we think the estimates are nearing almost $1 trillion. So unlike a lot of the grant programs that exist out there, which can be competitive, there's a certain dollar amount. These are statutory credits that are here. We're in the first year of implementation right now, and we're expected it's currently going to last about 10 years. So if you have a qualified investment, and a few categories that we see in the non-for-profit space, solar is probably the easiest, right? So rooftop solar is a really good example. You can get anywhere from 6% to 70% of the cost of that solar back in the form of a cash refund. And you mentioned one of the challenges, Tina. I would say the biggest challenge is, the tax code is complex. And so you're taking a whole group of entities, whether it's state and local government or non-for-profit, you're saying there's this really nice opportunity out there, never filed a tax return. That skill and capability is difficult to find. The complexity of the regulations. I mean, the IRS right now is coming out pretty much with weekly type guidance, and some of the guidance can be 150 pages around the way you go about claiming these incentives. And then you hear the benefit is 6% all the way up to 70%. And that just shows you that someone has to do the work to figure out what percentage of your investment actually qualifies for the refund. The good news is that the different percentages relate to, are you paying prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements? Is the project in a low income community or in a non-urban census tract? So there are basically multipliers of the benefit that is really trying to fuel and fund investments in underserved communities. It's also available to tribal communities. So it's not just non-for-profits, but tribal communities also are eligible for direct pay. So if those investments are happening on location there, they also can file a tax return. So basically, I kind of think of the categories of projects that are qualified: solar, renewable energy. That's probably the most prevalent that we're seeing. But just buying electric vehicles, buying a fleet, that's another whole area. So electrification of vehicles, there's refundable credits there. Energy storage, we're seeing a lot in the energy storage space around resiliency of facilities. So there's a whole body of credits around kind of facilities remodel. And so whether that's energy storage, whether that's solar on the roof, whether that's putting geothermal HVAC systems in, basically any type of clean energy investment you're going to be making, you should be looking at whether there's this refundable tax credit available to you. And I think it was mentioned earlier, the disadvantage of it's a great program. The disadvantage of the program is you have to make the investment. Once you place it in service, now you can ask the government for your refund, and that might take another 6 to 12 months. So there's a timing issue here, right? You got to have the money, you got to have the funds, you got to make the investment, you got to go through construction, you place it in service, and then you file your form with the IRS to get your refund back. And one of the things we're seeing around the country is in various states are standing up green banks or other things from the center at the state level to help provide potential bridge loan financing for that period of time from the start of the project until you place it in service and ultimately get the refund from the government. And so I think that's an interesting and innovative approach to help with the capital stack, is figuring out if there's some public-private bridge loan programs that can just help get you to the point where you're going to get your refund back from the IRS. So the timing of getting your refund, the complexity around the rules, and having the skills and capabilities to pursue it, I think those are the biggest challenges, Tina.
Excellent. When you said, I mean, you have a lot of visibility into how all states are doing this. So it sounds like that's one best practice, this idea of setting up a green bank. How's New Mexico doing, do you think, relative to others? What are some of the things that New Mexico is doing well? Maybe what are some of the things you think they might be doing better? And I think, Andrea, just to bring you back into the conversation as well, I think you had mentioned some visibility and some background on New Mexico's efforts around a green bank. So maybe we can come to you in just a minute for some of that. But David, just if you want to provide a little perspective on New Mexico relative to other states.
Yeah, I think number one, I think at the state level, New Mexico is doing great and really at the forefront of this. The starting point is the state that themselves need to go and get the refunds for their own projects, right? Mm-hmm. So the state is investing in qualified projects, whether that's solar or EVs, et cetera. So the state needs to go and build out and get their refund at the state level. And then as part of that, it's, what type, as part of this, that's why I was brought into this conversation, right? Is to figure out how do we get the word out to local communities, non-for-profits within the state to make sure they're taking advantage of the well. But I would just say this is so new and unprecedented that many states in the country right now haven't even thought through how they're going to take advantage of direct pay. And I would put New Mexico as one of the top 3 to 5 leaders in this space to evaluate how we can really unleash the power of this cash refund direct pay opportunity within the IRA.
Amazing. So Andrea, so New Mexico is leading on this front. Can you add a little color to maybe some of the things that are contributing to that, like the
Yeah,
green bank?
sure. In the conversations that we had too, and many of you in the audience know Beth Beloff, heading up the New Mexico Climate Investment Center that is fundraising right now to essentially be that green bank for New Mexico. I will put their URL in the chat for everybody just to understand, you know, what work they've been doing and trying to grow. And I know there's a lot of activity in the Santa Fe area, in the north that for us in the north of New Mexico that are working on a lot of this work to address climate change, but also to leverage all of these federal dollars. And certainly, you know, we've been looking at and wanting to track what they've been doing.
Amazing. I think it's a perfect opportunity now to turn to you, Sydney, because I think what we heard both from David and Christy is that one of the challenges is having the access to the capital to pay for some of these things that you're going to get reimbursed for later, and being able to wait long enough for that reimbursement, not to mention the complexity and all the other kind of administrative, technical capacity type issues. But I think you in particular have been involved in some delivering some really innovative solutions to that problem in the work that the foundation has done and through the Go ATL funds, particularly the Guarantee Fund. So can you tell us a little bit more about that and how that work has helped nonprofits overcome these types of challenges?
Absolutely. And sorry, the light just went out on me on this conference room. Apologies.
You gotta move around.
I gotta move around. Andrea,
Conserving energy.
Exactly. Andrea, would you mind sharing the slides? So yeah, as Tina mentioned, and as I alluded to in my introduction, I supported the impact investing work here at the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta, and that really started for us back in 2018 with something called the Community Capacity Fund. And it was our attempt to encourage donor-advised funds that were already at the community and foundation to be involved in the impact investing world. So we could pool different investments from them internally and invest that in place-based solutions to challenges that we saw across the region, whether that be accessing affordable housing, providing capital for small businesses, providing educational loans to start up charter schools locally, or protecting organic farmland. We had this really unique tool to respond to all these diversified needs across our community. That was kind of a yes and to our grant making. And because of those pre-established relationships with the CDFI partners that we supported through these funds, we had an interesting lens into the nonprofit landscape that they supported during COVID. So Dave talked a lot about, you know, the unprecedented dollars coming from the IRA. Our unprecedented moment was COVID. And Andrea, if you can go to the next slide. We were hearing from a lot of nonprofit partners on the grant making side, as well as through our CDFI partners through impact investing, that they were seeing these large scale dollars come from the federal government, whether it be through the CARES Act or ARPA dollars. And it had kind of a quick turnaround given the need, especially in the rapid rehousing space locally, to provide a lot of these services up front that were ultimately reimbursable for these government grants. So we heard that quite a lot from the first two speakers, that this challenge of reimbursable government grants really impacts the cash flow positions of our nonprofit partners who may or may not have experience taking on some of these government grant programs, which can be large and cumbersome and taxing, as we've heard in all these scenarios previously. So we heard all of this feedback and thought, what are the two things kind of keeping, or few things keeping these partners from taking this money and being able to implement the key safety net services needed during the COVID period? And the first thing we heard is these nonprofit partners were having a hard time accessing capital from traditional finance institutions. So they had this commitment of a government grant to do something like rapid rehousing for individuals experiencing homelessness. There was an amount, there was an award letter, but it was reimbursable. And they were smaller nonprofits for the most part, that this would have been really detrimental to them to take on this funding without the grant already in hand. It caused considerable strain for them financially, but they wanted to do the work. And so when they went out to try to get a line of credit or a bridge loan from a traditional bank, they got told no for a number of reasons. Either they didn't like the collateral that was presented in the grant letter, it was hard to underwrite, or it was really short term, and that's just not always appealing to lenders. And so we said, okay, first problem to solve is how do you even get the access? And so we went to these CDFI partners we had been working with for a few years through this fund and said, what can we do to incentivize you to take on these loans and help these nonprofits access the capital they need? And they said, we would love a guarantee. If you can guarantee that if this for some reason goes bad, you'll provide some first loss capital for us, then we'd be willing to do these short-term deals. So we said, sure, happy to do that. And I'll tell you how in a minute. And the second part was, how do you take the burden off of the nonprofits for having to pay interest on something they expected to be a grant? So now there's a burden tied to taking on these dollars by accessing a bridge loan. So we thought, well, why don't we raise a complementary grant fund that can help them with interest buy down? So that was kind of our two-tier solution that came from this brainstorm. And Andrea, if you'll go to the next slide, this is how we structured it. So we went to our foundation partners that had DAFs at the community foundation and said, can you help us raise some first loss capital so we can pilot this program? And they showed up, 5 different foundations to the tune of $850,000 for the guarantee pool, which served as a first loss pool for any of the loans that we were issuing guarantees to. And then we, as a community foundation, said we want to be part of the solution. So we provided $250,000 for that grant pool to help with interest buy down. And so we were able to facilitate some guarantees for nonprofit partners to help them achieve a number of things. So I gave the rapid rehousing example. We've also been able to support qualified programs like CDBG grants or Medicaid reimbursements, kind of any federal, county, city government receivable that tends to have a long tail of repayment, but that requires the nonprofits to do the work now to be able to provide those services. The way that we can afford this program is we charge a small fee to the CDFI partner for accessing the guarantee. It's usually just a one-time annual fee of 1.5% of the guaranteed amount. And then, most of these are short-term bridge loans, so they're only having to pay that once. And then our guarantee is up to 20% or not to exceed $200,000 of the underlying loan. So for example, most of the loans that we're helping support are between $250,000 and $2 million, but we would never go above $200,000 of that, just so we have some diversity in our portfolio. And we have this interest buy down account as well, as I mentioned. So the way that works is early on during COVID, interest rates were much lower. So we were able to pay the full amount. But as interest rates have risen over the years and this fund needs to be replenished, we're able to cover 100% of the first 4.5% of the interest rate for these nonprofits, and then half of anything over that. So then the impact on them is nominal as they're taking on that loan from the CDFI partner. And I would say our average interest buy down grant is between $10,000 and $20,000. So not huge, but able to make a big difference. So we've done 5 of these so far in a lot of different sectors, early ones during COVID to support some of that CARES Act funding. But we had a recent example of an early learning center that got a CDBG grant to do some cafeteria overhaul, kind of update things at a playground, replace their roof. And they had to provide funding for that all up front with contractors and everything else to get the process moving, and didn't have that kind of cash on hand. So we helped them secure a loan from the Reinvestment Fund, which is a national partner, and provided a guarantee in support of that, and then provided them with a grant to take that burden off them financially for accessing those dollars. And then they can move forward on the timeline needed to get that reimbursable grant from the government. So it's been a really effective program for us. We've actually had so much success, and there's so much pipeline in the state, which is good and bad, right? It means there's a lot of really long delays in some of these repayment periods that we've actually gotten permission from our finance committee to scale this 3 to 1. So we'll now have over $2.5 million to provide guarantees. These are unfunded guarantees, and really all that means is we don't have to actually move money out unless the underlying loan is not repaid. So we do serve as that first loss capital if anything goes wrong, but really, as you all know, it's more a matter of timing than it is repayment. And so most of these, and all in our case, have been repaid. It's just when. And so we can provide some confidence to these CDFI partners that even if when is longer than you think, we're there to be a partner. So quickly, I'll just share this last slide, which was another great case study. The first one we did out of the guarantee pool during COVID, and it was for a long-standing rapid rehousing organization that got a humongous grant through the city of Atlanta that tripled their budget overnight to help individuals experiencing homelessness move into affordable housing, which of course it's always important. It was incredibly important during that time. And so this was such a huge outlay of cash flow that they said without our guarantee and the bridge loan that they would have been at financial risk if they took this on, and they would have maybe been unable to accept these time sensitive and critical federal funds. So this kind of freed them up to say yes, to do the work and to be in a position to do it in a more financially strong way. And you can see some of the impacts there. It both preserved and increased their capacity to support individuals locally, and it helped them sustain and build new jobs during a time where job growth was kind of stagnant. So this has been a really great tool for us, and I've gone on too long, but happy to answer more questions as we keep going.
Thanks so much, Sydney. I love this example. I think it's a really great example of how a community foundation in this case was able to bring to bear the resources that it has, bringing donors to the table to be really targeted and responsive and work with CDFI partners in the community. And then also just a really great example of what we were talking about earlier with integrated capital, right? So using the grant dollars as a buy down, the CDFIs are actually providing the loan capital. The capital that those CDFIs have to deploy comes from, in many cases, impact investments of one sort or another, whether it's from banks or from other foundations or lenders as well. So it's just, I think, a really great example of how to weave together all the various tools and the pieces of the puzzle in order to be responsive to nonprofits to be able to take advantage of this moment in time where there are these tremendous resources available that can benefit, in this case, the state of New Mexico. So appreciate you sharing that.
Of course.
So David, maybe turning back to you, thinking back to the preparation for this conversation, and again, we've been talking about the tremendous resources available at this time in the federal government, even beyond the Inflation Reduction Act. You had mentioned that despite all these resources being available, they're oftentimes undersubscribed. I think that, we probably intuitively understand why as a result of all the things that we've already highlighted. But can you just, again, talk through a little bit more kind of what that is and or why that is and some of the things that Deloitte is doing to address the problem?
Yeah, a couple things. I think, some of the things I've said where at the federal level, various infrastructure meetings put on by the federal government through the National Governors Association, where they've had representatives from DOE, from EPA, from the various federal agencies, and everyone in the room kind of went through their programs. The DOE has loan programs, the DOE has grant programs, the USDA has grant programs. The EPA just issued a ton of money out to the states to help with their loan programs. I think what became evident as part of that session was there's so many programs, and how do they interact with one another? And can you stack them on top of one another? If you accept a grant here, does that prevent you from claiming the tax credit that I talked about earlier around the refund? I think there's so much money out there from different federal agencies, and it's very complex to figure out, where to get started. That was the number one question, like, where do I get started, right? Mm-hmm. And a couple takeaways. Number one is these federal agencies all have technical assistance, resources. They all, when the question was, where do I get started? It was, reach out to the DOE, ask questions, et cetera. And they have assistance dollars to help people navigate all of these different opportunities. I think for us at Deloitte, we're trying to leverage, some innovative tools, whether that's using artificial intelligence to kind of figure out what all is out there, both from a federal and state. I mean, there's various state programs that are available, grant programs as well, but trying to use AI in a way that can say, okay, I'm going to invest in solar, right? Ask AI, I'm going to invest in solar. And out the other side comes, here is the 12 different programs that are available out there from the federal government that might be able to assist you with a solar investment. So I would recommend, reaching out to the federal agencies, as well as, thinking through, how to use technology in a way that'll allow you to streamline, the approach around evaluating various credits, grants, incentives, loans, et cetera.
Yeah, fantastic. And I know that we talked a little bit, and maybe this is something that we can kind of note as a follow-up from this session, but I know that we had talked a little bit about maybe engaging with Deloitte, who obviously has a lot of expertise. And I seem to recall you mentioned having, maybe even thousands of people used in kind of looking at these programs to really study and understand them and catalog them. And so I think that there could be some opportunity there. And Christy, you in our kind of preparation as well for the dialogue had mentioned that there is in fact a group that's come together to think about how to support nonprofits and accessing these programs, right? Because I think it's not as simple as, every organization that's on the call today sort of picking up the phone and calling DOE to get some help. I think if we could do that in a coordinated fashion across the state, leveraging the expertise of partners like Deloitte, I mean, that could lead to some really amazing outcomes. So Christy, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that group that's come together and, what they're doing and how they're doing it.
Yeah, so we had a group of funders that back in, I think it was 2001, came together, and there was only 3 groups, and they pooled funds together, said, hey, we need to support this back-end grant application. So we need to get just dollars to organizations so that they can apply for these funds, essentially. And I'm looking at the numbers here because I don't have them off the top of my head, but they gave out to 25 different groups $346,000 in grants to support the application process. And the return on investment was $39 million. So that ROI is extremely impactful, especially in a state like New Mexico. And so I dropped into the chat the link. This fund is housed at the Santa Fe Community Foundation. It's now expanded from 3 organizations to, I think there's like 12 or 15 organizations. And we're looking at a really unique way to change what we're doing, how we support organizations, local governments, tribal communities, pueblos, in accessing these federal funds. And as David mentioned, state opportunities as well. So what they're transitioning to is really looking at how they can resource intermediary organizations like Groundworks, like the Grant Plant, which provided a lot of this research. So for any of those, we've got a lot of nonprofits here. We hosted our annual social sector conference in February, and the Grant Plant did a presentation on this work that they were commissioned by the funder group to do, that really just was a landscape survey of like what's happening in other states, what are the biggest challenges that are being faced right now with accessing these funds, what do we need to do kind of collectively. And a lot of that was, we need to collaborate, we need to start coming together across the state and finding a way to access these funds, not just as this isolated organization, but in community. How do we start doing things like providing back-end support? So we're providing that grant management, grant application, support services through different organizations. So they're actually in an LOI process right now. So I would encourage, and we're applying for this. It's not going to be a one-stop shop approach. Like, this is going to take our whole community to rise to the challenge here, because we have so many dollars that are on the national table that we can bring into our state right now that can really change the way that we are serving our communities, change how communities can bring in support services, bring in broadband, really address some of our like top issues like water and climate change, clean energy, because we're we have a very large oil and gas community, and it's been phenomenal for our state budget. But how do we move away from that as we're collectively trying to move to clean energy? And we don't have a solution yet. So how do we start to bring in these dollars to address these big issues? So Groundworks in particular, we're looking at how do we build out our social sector institute. We have two arms. So we have the Center for Strategic Partnerships, and then we have the Center for Nonprofit Excellence. And this serves statewide. So we're looking at building a third arm for our institute. How can we do something where we're centrally locating the strategic partnerships aspect, where we're doing more of these like pooled projects and collaborative initiatives, as well as like the CNPE side, where we're doing the education, the training, and the resources. And this third arm will be more of that backbone support of how can we create a center where this work is being supported, where we're, maybe it's leveraging AI and working with grant writers and really finding, how do we start just going through the volume of opportunities that are out there, and then pairing those opportunities to the nonprofits that we have, because we have, I think it's something like, what did we discuss in our number? It's like almost 10,000 nonprofit organizations that are registered here in New Mexico. But the number that are staffed is a couple thousand. How do we start to pair these organizations with the opportunities, start to bring those organizations together so that they can pool their collective resources and really bring that back in support? So we've got grant writers and finance folks so that you can manage the grant and figure out how to do the reporting. A lot of these grants have auditing requirements if you get over a certain threshold. So it brings in a whole nother burden. So how can we start as these like intermediary organizations providing these back-end support services and just uniting our organizations? And I love that you brought Deloitte in, because I think one of the things that we've really kind of failed to do as a sector is bring in private business. Like how can we start to create those partnerships? And Groundworks is really about like working with nonprofits, local governments, and we're really starting to look at this other piece of how do we reach into communities, whether it's businesses or professionals that are serving in these other areas, to leverage that collective expertise and wisdom to start to move the needle in our state.
Yeah. Amazing. And it's, it almost, when you say it, it's almost common sense, right? But much easier said than done. And I think what's interesting about that concept and that model is that there are parallels already that exist. And we talked about this again a bit in our conversation, right? In the venture capital world, for example, there are fund administrators that handle all the back end administration for venture capital fund managers, right? They aren't each building all that back office infrastructure independently on their own. They have figured out that they need to have some efficiency by having these companies kind of spring up to do this work. And I think I think that there's something to that, right? Trying to achieve that efficiency, and there are examples and models that can be looked at to kind of leverage and learn from what they've done and how they've done it. So super interesting. So before we turn to you, Sydney, for some maybe final thoughts and a bit of advice, David, can we come back to you for a moment? Because one other piece that you had mentioned as well that I think is really important and relevant for the state of New Mexico is the work that Deloitte is doing with tribal communities. So can you say a little bit more about that? What is the nature of the work that you're doing? How are you supporting tribal and Pueblo communities in this mix?
Yeah, I think I mentioned one of the eligible entities under the direct pay or the cash refund is tribal communities, right? So they are eligible for direct pay refunds under the Inflation Reduction Act. And again, the communities, they didn't have the capability or skills. They didn't have any tax expertise. And you mentioned the oil and gas industry. I mean, one of the big areas around the Inflation Reduction Act is around carbon sequestration and what the oil and gas industry is doing with carbon sequestration. And so that's an area that we've leaned in heavily as everyone is kind of evaluating the clean energy transition and possibly moving away from fossil fuels. Carbon sequestration is a very valuable tax credit that exists under the Inflation Reduction Act, and that is eligible for a cash refund. So, but it's very complex in terms of how you calculate it, how you determine it, how you document it. So we've really leaned in on the carbon sequestration front to help various entities figure out how they're going to secure their cash refund around that very specific kind of industry issue that exists within oil and gas and the clean energy transition.
Great. Thanks, David. So Sydney, as I mentioned, maybe turning back to you before we turn to the audience for questions. And again, I'll just remind everybody, I'm not seeing those questions in the chat, so I will be cold calling. So just get ready for that. But before we turn to that, Sydney, any advice that you have, I think, just given your experience for other impact investors, organizations that are looking to deploy integrated capital to nonprofits to be supportive, anything that you can share based on your lessons learned, your experience, the successes you've had, and maybe some of the bumps in the road along the way.
Yeah, of course. So I think kind of two things. One, for my funders in the room, for those that are thinking about impact investing, there's a lot of different ways to approach working capital needs for nonprofits. I gave an example of one that's worked for us and kind of a niche space of these government reimbursable programs, but understanding that is not a one size fits all. You know, our original funds supporting the capacity of CDFIs. There are some CDFIs that are willing to do this work without a guarantee. Some that work on a national scale and might be present in New Mexico, like Nonprofit Finance Fund, that they're really good at providing working capital lines of credit and other things for some of our nonprofit partners that may not be able to access a traditional bank line of credit or loan. So there are some national partners that may be active where you are, and being able to support them or incentivize them to think about some of these working capital needs is great. The guarantee product is another great way to think about this, which, as I mentioned, it's unfunded. So even if you don't raise a first loss pool yourself from philanthropic partners, there is a way to make these guarantees without having any money leave your balance sheet. And for these investments in particular, as I mentioned, it's more of a timing issue than a repayment issue. So we've never had to pay out any of these guarantees or have any of them called upon. So that's not the case for everything. And we certainly see ourselves in the mirror and know we could take more risk. And I think that's phase 2 of this work. But we do also have an economic inclusion fund here, which is meant to be kind of a working capital provider to our small businesses and nonprofits here in Georgia. It's able to provide really patient flex debt. So thinking about, you know, more competitive interest rates, grace periods, deferment periods, seasonal payments, things that can help nonprofit partners where they're at and be a little more flexible than your traditional bank with kind of a typical amort schedule that may not work for everyone. So those are a couple ways to think about bringing your dollars to the table in addition to grants. And then for everyone on the call, just remembering the power of your voice and your story, that if you're finding that this rings true for you and you're experiencing a lot of these challenges from government grants in particular. We had a lot of success when we had an administration change in the city of Atlanta. Our president was able to go to him and share some priorities from the Community Foundation. And one was, our nonprofit partners are experiencing tremendous delays on some of these grants, and how can we help you make it better? Like, what we're providing through this guarantee pool is a Band-Aid, but there needs to be some changes through the deployment of those dollars at the government level to actually make a difference. And so it did slightly improve HOPWA repayment periods for a bit. Nothing's perfect or forever sustaining, but I think just remembering the power of your voice in these conversations too.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sydney. And I think that's an important reminder, because we did spend quite a bit of time talking about the challenges with federal funding and accessing federal resources. But I think very similar challenges exist in working with state and local government in terms of, well, complexity, yes, but delays, just delays in reimbursement because of administrative delays, whatever it might be. And that presents real challenges. And I think probably just compounds the challenges that exist in accessing resources at the federal level. So that's really important to keep in mind. All right, so we are going to turn to some Q&A. We do have some questions for our participants, which I think I'm going to copy and drop in the chat. And in the meantime, maybe Andrea, you can, I think you had a couple of questions, and I think we had a couple of questions come in. So maybe you can facilitate posing those questions while I drop these in the chat.
Yeah, sure. I think first that came through was talking about rurality. And of course, we know New Mexico is the most rural state in the US, and perhaps Georgia and some other geographies wrestle with this. But how can some of our rural communities be considered in this process, and how are they vetted perhaps for Sydney and others, like that where capacity is an issue, and others? I think there's a question of how do we consider that? And that's coming from Sonia. Does anyone want to take it? Feel free to hop in.
I'll just say for Groundworks, one of the things that, so for those that don't know, kind of stepping back, we used to be the New Mexico Association of Grant Makers. In 2020, we reorganized, acquired the Center for Nonprofit Excellence, and really grew our programming. And that Center for Nonprofit Excellence only used to serve Albuquerque, and we've really focused on how do we provide these capacity building services, which can, what does that mean? Like professional development, workforce development, organizational support, and bringing those services to all four corners of our state, really making sure that we've got an equitable distribution of our services. So that's been a really key priority for us. We're in a pilot stage right now for a blueprint model for these capacity building services, and that is focused on education right now. But we're hoping to scale this next year and have 10 to 15 cohorts that will be focused on all of our critical needs, and kind of in the education space, break those things out. So early childhood, K through 12, youth opportunity, but then expanding to the clean energy transition, water, housing, of course, is a huge issue. And so bringing those communities so that we have folks that are in rural greater New Mexico that are connecting with people from all across the state. So they're learning in community, sharing those resources, and not, just not feeling isolated either. That's one of the biggest challenges of working, is that sometimes you feel like you're working in isolation. Having lived in a town of 200 people, I know what that looks like. So I think, being able to connect and learn from what others are doing, not reinventing that wheel, and seeing what are communities that are similarly situated to your rural community doing in other parts of the state. So I just want to offer that we're always happy to connect our nonprofit and government partners with other folks in the state. So if we can be of service, don't hesitate to reach out. And I'm sure that Tina will be sharing our contact information with folks. So please reach out.
Excellent. Sydney, did you want to hop in? Yeah, go ahead.
Just one quick thing that's been interesting for us in Georgia is we primarily focus on Metro Atlanta, a couple of core counties. But that being said, we recognize that other parts of the state needs access to resources as well. So one way we've showed up is thinking about co-investments. So for instance, if there are other community foundations that don't have as many resources, particularly unrestricted ones that want to be involved in this work, then we can think about ways to invest alongside them, and even handle some of the diligence or other aspects in-house here, and maybe set it up as a participation or something else that can help their dollars go further. That plus, thinking about our loans as maybe having a preponderance of activity here in Metro Atlanta, but having some scalability outside of the state as part of the loan requirements, so that they do have more flexibility and it doesn't feel as restrictive and just focusing on already well-resourced areas of the city. So that's just a couple of ways we've thought about more statewide access.
Fantastic.
Super interesting. So we had a question in the chat versus the Q&A, and then we had another question in our Q&A. I think we were trying to bring Meta in if they're available to talk about the question on the guarantee pool. And then we'll go to the question in the chat.
Yep. Hi, I'm here.
Oh, great. Go ahead, Meta.
I was going to ask Sydney, for these loans that CDFIs were making to nonprofits, but were being guaranteed by the pool, what was the review process with the pool once the CDFI felt like they had identified a great lending opportunity with a nonprofit? And I'm going to do a follow-up question while I'm asking it, because it just occurred to me, what were these potential loans identified by the guarantee pool or by the CDFIs? Both. Curious to hear about kind of the pipeline of requests that were coming in and where those were sourced.
Yeah, thanks for that. And apologies, I just got booted out of a meeting room, so that's why I had to go off camera real quick. The challenges of hybrid work. So I caught the second part of that question, Meta, but would someone recap the first part for me?
Sure. I was just asking what the review process with the pool was on those loans to nonprofits made by CDFIs. CDFI said, we like this loan, we want to do it. What was the review process within the pool?
Yeah, of course. So because we underwrite a lot of these CDFI partners ourselves as part of the capacity fund, we have a pretty good understanding of how they do diligence and how they understand underlying deals. So we had a lot of confidence and put a lot of confidence in their underwriting processes for these loans. As we think about review, we wanted to see that award letter in hand for the government source of funding and understand what the timing was and any other compliance components that could make it so that it's not repaid. And then we're kind of leaning on the CDFI for all of that extra diligence, which we also ask for copies of and review just to make sure the nonprofit's in good financial health otherwise, that they have a strong board of directors, kind of key, nonprofit health elements. In terms of where deal flow and pipeline are coming from, it's a little bit of a couple different sources. Sometimes the CDFIs run across these nonprofits, know we have this product, and bring the deal to us asking for partnership or for the guarantee. Other times through our community impact team here at the foundation, these nonprofits come through them and they hear about this challenge they have with cash flow, and the nonprofit has come to them seeking a grant, not knowing that we have this product that could help them through a guarantee. And sometimes we just meet folks in the community. So increasingly it's word of mouth and marketing and making people aware that this product exists and can be helpful to them. Hopefully that answers your question.
That was great. Thank you.
Of course.
Great. I think we're going to go to our next question from Rusty. If you can go ahead and ask. I know it was in the chat, and go right ahead. Do we have Rusty with us?
I see Rusty.
Rusty, we have your audio on if you're there. And
Yes,
able.
ma'am.
There we go.
There we go.
Okay. We are searching. I have been searching for 2+ years through all sorts of federal grants, foundational grants, to try to help facilitate building some workforce housing in addition to an assisted living facility. But through most of this research, rural communities are totally excluded. from any type of funding? Any suggestion?
You were looking for particular programs, I think, in your question, right? If anybody was familiar with any specific funding sources.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I think, Chrissy, I'm not sure if it's contained, but I saw that you dropped a link that is a curated guide of funding opportunities. And it looks like there is a section for housing in that, I see, correct?
Yeah, so I'll just say a little bit about this. So again, this is the Grant Plant. This is an organization that is based in Albuquerque that provides grant research and writing support services. They have put together this federal funding guide, and they have a New Mexico grant priority program. So I dropped the link in the chat for that. You can toggle any of the sectors. So there's housing. I'm not seeing one that is particularly for rural communities, but if you look at that, the very first thing that comes up if you click housing is rural housing preservation grants. So that's one option, is just kind of looking through. It looks like there are 8 opportunities in housing. So you might find some resources there. The other I'm going to put in the chat here is an email address. So Greg Nadel is the research specialist for federal grants that is with Senator Heinrich's office. And you can reach out to him, and he will, if you have like a document or just set up an appointment to chat with him. He's really helpful. He's been great in talking about, here are some opportunities, doing research on behalf of organizations and really trying to channel these dollars to New Mexico. So I would also reach out to Greg.
Okay. I attended a grant writing meeting in Albuquerque a couple of weeks ago when it's spoken with the grant plant. Here again, it's just for nonprofits, is trying to come up with the money to offset the cost of writing these, huge federal grants. I mean, we're looking at $15,000 to $25,000 just for them to write the grants for us. And for nonprofits, it's hard for us to come up with that type of cash flow to have these grants written for us.
Yeah, I think that's actually, I think that's a really, again, just important point to emphasize. And I think part of the purpose for having this conversation and really central to some of the things that NMIIC as a collaborative of integrated capital providers in the state of New Mexico is thinking about. Because while on the one hand, addressing some of the financial challenges we've talked about, the delays in reimbursement or having to cover upfront costs that maybe are partially reimbursed on the back end, but take a really long time, all those sorts of things. So one need is providing, working capital to be able to do that. The example Sydney provided sort of facilitated making that happen, using guarantees to incentivize CDFIs to make those loans. But I think as you're mentioning, Rusty, the other challenge is just the needing sort of technical assistance or expanded capacity, right? And that really does require either grant dollars to help nonprofits cover that, or providing greater efficiency in delivering the resources that can help with that. So some of the work that Christy was talking about of these funders who've come together to try and address that. So I think while we don't have any immediate solutions, I think part of the reason for the conversation today is to really better understand those challenges, those nuances, and think about how we can better weave together the resources and the capacity, the expertise that New Mexico has to help the nonprofit sector with those challenges. And I know that NMIIC as a collaborative is thinking about how to do that, how it can use its resources to not only help facilitate the working capital, but also to help facilitate the grants in a more efficient way, and how to support efforts like what Christy was talking about, how to leverage private partners like Deloitte and the work that David does. So yes. I would say I don't have an immediate answer for you, but stay tuned.
Okay, well, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And just to say too, just on the workforce housing bit and the timing, I just put in the chat what the state of New Mexico is doing through the NMFA, the New Mexico Finance Authority, through the Opportunity Enterprise Housing revolving loan fund. And I understand that they have capacity dollars as well available for that planning. They just had a webinar this week, past week. And so, you know, again, just being able to share information with folks about what's happening in and around the state to leverage would be great.
Yeah.
And again, the timing, as back to David's comments, is everything for these things that will close as of October 16th. So again, very quick turnarounds.
Okay. Appreciate your input.
Thank you. Thanks for the question, Rusty. All right, so maybe coming back, I'm keeping an eye on chat here. I think we're getting some great comments. Are there any additional questions? Maybe I'll ask Carla. I know you've been keeping an eye here. And if not, Andrea, I know that you had a couple questions that you had in mind. Maybe you want to share those.
Sure. Just from a policy perspective, I know there's a number of legislators that are looking at essentially abolishing the anti-donation clause in New Mexico, which could be transformative for the access to capital for nonprofits, and of course the hoops that everyone has to jump through in order to apply for a grant at a given time, make sure they have the capacity to run that grant, and of course just be able to respond in kind. And of course what the state has to do to get around the anti-donation clause in many ways. I'm just curious what your thoughts are as nonprofit leaders and folks who represent those folks, that what that would be like. And if there, maybe for Sydney too, what it looks like in Georgia for states' involvements and being able to help prop up nonprofits as well. But whoever wants to start out, that would be interesting to hear from you all while this is being pondered. Anybody? Is it too much? Christy, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think the anti-donation clause, that's like a whole huge can of worms. I think we punt it to Sydney and find out what is the answer.
I can't say I know much about that, unfortunately, in Georgia. But you know, happy to explore and get back to the group.
Very cool. And just for folks, just to inform, so New Mexico has this unique impediment to being able to distribute funds to nonprofits that are helping government do their great work, which means that we have to go around the inability to give donations, quote unquote, to organizations that are functioning in their working capital, and also just some of the other opportunities that the state may be able to invest in. In order to do that, we jump through a bunch of legal hoops to get RFPs out, and then it gets complicated, and then the timing is short, and then we don't, even the state doesn't have the resources to do this in an effective way oftentimes. And so it's sort of the step zero to a number of the step ones that folks would like to have available, as far as just being able to have this capital in the work that they're doing. And so there's been a movement to try to address this. And certainly, I think in 2025, a number of legislators, myself included, will be working on this as a way to drive capital into our communities in a more direct way, while also being sure that we're wrapping around, you know, all of the different components of making sure that it's invested well, and all of those other frameworks. But that's what the anti-donation conversation is about.
Andrea, what does SSBCI look like in New Mexico?
Ooh, we have Russ, I believe, in attendance here. Russ, I'd love to pull you in. He is our resident SSBCI expert. He runs that program. I wonder if Russ is willing to come off of out of the attendees and talk a little bit about that program. But they are a partner member of NMIIC as well, so we do get to you know, often hear about what's going on. I'm seeing comments back on the anti-donation question, which is very reassuring. But yeah, Russ, if we can, let's see if you're available to talk about SSBCI. I've given you the permission to speak if you're available.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, great.
Yeah. Thanks. This is Russ Cummins with the New Mexico Small Business Investment Corporation. And SSBCI is being managed part by Economic Development Department and part by New Mexico Finance Authority. And we're receiving, these are rough numbers, but we're scheduled to receive about 74 million in total SSBCI. And I know that we've received the first tranche, which was around 20 million. The first 20 million, I think about 15 million of that has been allocated for venture capital. And then there are ongoing discussions about what to do with additional funds that have been received or yet to be received. But a lot of the discussion has been around trying to come out with programs to support CDFIs in New Mexico. And now we currently have a collateral support program that's been operated by Economic Development Department for several years. And so part of the funding is going to be to continue that collateral support program. But the New Mexico Finance Authority is also looking at coming out with a couple of new programs and possibly a loan participation program, which I think that might be primarily banks, but I think CDFIs could also participate in the loan participation program. But they're also looking at coming out, and I don't think this is out yet, but the New Mexico Finance Authority has told me that they are looking at coming out with a loan program, a subordinated debt program for CDFIs that would be similar to the EQ2 type funding that banks provide to CDFIs. That's the equity equivalent. So it'd be subordinated debt that SSBCI funds might be used to provide to CDFIs. So they're working on coming out with some different programs to assist CDFIs in the state.
Thanks for that, Russ.
Thanks, Russ. I was just going to follow up and ask Sydney whether that's even an issue for Georgia. In Georgia, is it an issue for government to be able to provide capital directly to nonprofits?
I
Or
don't.
do you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think our SSBCI program, that's why I asked it. It's kind of similar to how Russ just described it in New Mexico. I don't know that I've been directly involved in understanding that direct relationship, so I couldn't speak to the legality of it, but I know the venture side and then the CDFI support through SSBCI has been an incredible vehicle for freeing up some additional working capital for our small businesses and nonprofits across the state. And just using that, not only the participation type things that Russ mentioned, but also there's some guaranteed dollars through the state as well that have done a lot to encourage others to take part in this need for working capital. So it's been a good partner, but I don't know that I can speak specifically to the legality of some of those things in Georgia, but this is a good opportunity for me to learn more, I think.
Great. So we have just a few more minutes left. I'm going to see if there are additional questions.
There was a hand raised in the attendees, and we just had one more question that came up, I think, through the chat. Henry, if you are available, we'd love to have you ask that, and I will give you the ability to come on off of mute. And this was a question pointed to David.
Yeah, in the presentation earlier, David, you posed the hypothetical question: are projects that are grant funded or investments that are grant funded eligible for IRA tax credits? And I'm guessing by the fact that you didn't answer yes or no that it's probably like it depends and it's complicated. But maybe you could give a sort of a little bit of color on that, please.
Yeah, great question, Henry. I will try to simplify it because it can't. So the answer is you have to evaluate how the grants could impact the tax credit. But I mean, an easy example of it, if it's 100% grant funded, you will not get a tax credit, okay? Because you're going to basically at that point make money on the project because you would get a refund from the government as well as it would be 100% grant funded. So that's the easy example, is you do not get a tax credit for a 100% specific grant funded project. However, if it was a 50-50 grant and matching funds, there is the opportunity there to get both a grant and a tax credit. Really, it boils down to what is the grant, what are the matching funds, and your cost plus the tax credit itself can't exceed essentially what the grant is. So there is the opportunity here to double dip and really minimize the cost of a clean energy investment between grants and tax credits. But it also, I think, plays into an overall strategy around funding. Like in terms of, should you try to spread the grants out amongst multiple projects so that you can fully take advantage of all the tax credits, or use it on one project? So I think the easiest way is, if it's 100% grant funded, there would be no IRA tax credit refund. If it's a 50-50, there is an opportunity. And then if you get into other percentages, more or less, you have to evaluate what the total cost of the project is plus the tax credit against the grant. So I hope that helps.
Yes, that was super helpful.
Case in point, it's complicated.
Right.
Super complex answer.
Just wanted to allow Scott to talk if he still has a question to pose. And I saw his hand up, but maybe that was inadvertent. But either way, you have permission, and I think otherwise that wraps up questions for now.
Yeah, Andrea, this is Scott.
Oh,
Thanks.
there you are. Okay, great.
Yeah, appreciate that. This is Scott Lopez. I'm the founder of Vida Mejor Capital. We are an aspiring CDFI operating in the food financing space in New Mexico. We also operate in broadband and energy policy, as Andrea knows. SSBCI is a really tricky one for us in New Mexico because there is a real debt aversion among, a lot of our small business lenders. And, we had a $500,000 pot of money that we had partnered with NCRC, National Community Reinvestment Corporation, to help them, go solicit, 2%, 3%, 4% loans at, 4 or 5%, 4 or 5 year term rates. And we didn't get one taker out of our food financing. Small rural farmers and ranchers, they all wanted grants, right? And so, when we're looking at SSBCI, I'm very concerned that in New Mexico, we're not going to have a really good base of local New Mexican businesses that can actually go access this money. It was very disheartening that most SSBCI dollars that the ED, Mexico Economic Development Department, and I'm not pointing fingers at anybody, it's just the way SSBCI is written, went to out-of-state venture capital firms, right? And out-of-state debt firms. Didn't come home to a lot of the folks that are on the front lines trying to, move some of our small businesses forward. So very tricky. And I just want to applaud this group, especially Andrea and Tina. I've not met you before, but Avivar's really been, at the forefront of this and the creation of NMIIC, but it's a tricky thread, right? I mean, one final data point, we work very closely with tribal entities, and there are Navajo Nation SSBCI allocations, significant ones, and they're not sure if the businesses exist to get the money out the door, right? So just, how do we create that technical assistance, that operational capacity with some grant support, and then eventually get people where they can actually, they're not afraid of debt and can use debt to actually grow their businesses, as opposed to relying on grants to subsidize them forever. Like the last thing I'll say is, how do we get some of these folks in our state, maybe see it in your states too, how do we get them from a grant subsidy model like a nonprofit, when they're supposed to be for profit and they're supposed to be sustainable and growing over time? So it's just something that we see on the front lines, and we have over 135 applicants and awardees in our food financing world, and that's growing. So anyway, just some data points to share, and I do applaud this group. It's not easy what we're trying to accomplish. So thank you very much for the mic, Andrea. Thank you.
Well, Scott, I'll jump in. So first, really nice to meet you in this forum. And
yeah.
if we get a chance to follow up, but I think it's a really excellent point. And frankly, as you're talking, the parallels I'm drawing are with some of the work that we did during the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, when I used to work with the California Endowment, which is the largest healthcare conversion foundation in California. And I was there in the 2008 to 2013 period when we were thinking about how do we support community health centers in the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. And at that time, a lot of community health centers were really averse to taking on debt. It sounds a lot like what you're describing now. And yet they needed to really expand and renovate and upgrade in preparation for what was expected to be this increased demand resulting from, more folks having access to coverage. And so there was a lot of education required in that, and helping these health centers to understand that debt isn't necessarily a bad thing. Using debt thoughtfully, strategically can help to grow an organization and help them to reach, sustainability. Maybe not scale, because maybe that's not the goal, but just to be a sustainable organization that isn't dependent on grant dollars all the time.
Right.
But I think, not everybody sort of understands that, and it is a shift in thinking and approach. And so, maybe that's a conversation we can have. How do we help to deliver some education? Maybe that's a conversation Groundworks can help with. Or maybe because you're talking about for-profit, like small businesses, maybe there are other organizations that can also help as an intermediary in delivering that education, that understanding.
Yeah. Can you guys still hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. No, Tina, absolutely. A lot of, we've got USDA grants. We partner with NMIIC, New Mexico State University. We partner with EDD. The loan fund is one of the CDFIs that the collateral program that was described earlier is a part of. They're a provider for us and partner. And we're talking to JP Morgan, we're talking to Bank of America, we're talking to US Bank, Wells, PNC, the folks that are active in our markets, because we need that financial literacy, right? We need some of that basic business capacity for some of these folks. They're not doing online banking, they're not doing digital banking, they're not doing a lot of things that could really help them streamline and maybe start to digest a $5,000 or a $10,000 or $20,000 loan for some equipment or some value-added production or whatever. So yes, we're doing that work and love to talk to anybody who wants to learn with us or partner with us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great follow-up conversation.
Thank you so much.
Could I add one quick thing that's
Absolutely.
for us in Georgia? Scott, thanks for your comments. And a lot of that resonates true for our small business communities as well. I mentioned we have a small business loan fund here at the foundation. And as we stood that up, since we were newer to the small business community and historically worked more with nonprofits, we wanted to create kind of a pipeline generating vehicle for that, understanding that we weren't going to be the only lender that could talk to or serve many of these businesses, and that capital readiness, to your point, was critical to ensuring that these businesses were set up for success. So we actually partnered with a bunch of different mission-aligned lenders statewide to stand up something called Go Georgia Capital. So it's using a platform called Connect to Capital that Community Reinvestment Fund, a national CDFI, created. And it's actually a one-stop shop. So a small business or nonprofit could come in, fill out a simple application, and they're connected based on their size, what kind of capital they're looking for, and other kind of credit boxes to a variety of lenders statewide. One element we've thought about adding there is, on the continuum, if grant dollars makes more sense for them, what are some grant partners we could bring to that? But it really helps them think about stair stepping. And then if they aren't capital ready, we have a slew of technical assistance, kind of entrepreneur support organizations that work with us, that we can take those folks that got no's and help them figure out how to get to a yes. So it's in the second year of its pilot now, and we've been able to close some deals through it so far. It's, definitely still iterating, but I think it's been an interesting way to get at the question you asked.
That's fantastic, and I would love to learn more about that. just met with Matt McNeil, who's the new NCRC director, I guess, at one of our meetings. Yeah, I would love to, because we're kind of doing that already with, we just got an RBDG grant from USDA to provide technical assistance to some of our tribal entities. We're working with consultants to do exactly what you're talking about. So would love to learn more and benchmark. That's awesome. Thank you.
I can share the link in the chat.
Great. Thanks, Sydney. Scott, thanks so much for the comments. And I'm taking note of time. It looks like we are up on time for today's learning session, but want to really thank our panelists for just a compelling discussion, and for our participants as well for being engaged and sharing great questions, great comments. We encourage you all to connect with us on social media. So, connect via LinkedIn, follow the NMIIC's Instagram account, and we'll be sending out the recording from today's session. And if you have any questions, reach out via email and be in touch with NMIIC or with us here at Avivar Capital, and we're happy to connect you with NMIIC. So really appreciate everybody's participation, and excited about following up on some of the ideas that were surfaced today. So thank you.
Just a quick plug, Tina, our
Oh,
annual summit is on November 12th. Just to save the date for those that are interested in connecting further about the work that we're doing as a collaborative. We just want everyone to know about that. And then, of course, thank you all for today. And again, the links are in the chat, and we'll be sending this out shortly. Thanks so much.
Great work. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Sydney, David, Christy.
Thanks.